My grandmother is very strange. When I was little, my grandmother always seemed like a regular kind old lady. She often baked cookies, told stories, and patted my head when I fell asleep. But as I grew older, I began to notice oddities in her behavior. It all started with small things. She often talked to herself, and I thought she was just forgetful. One night, I woke up to the sound of her voice. Getting out of bed, I went to the kitchen where she sat by candlelight, whispering to herself. When I asked whom she was talking to, she turned sharply and said, "Old habits, grandson. Go back to sleep." For a while, I thought my grandmother was just aging. But one day, while I was in her room, I found an old book in her closet, written in an unknown language. The pages were yellowed, and the text was written in blood. I asked my grandmother about the book, but she just frowned and told me not to touch her things. Weeks passed, and one evening I woke up again to strange sounds. This was not just a whisper. I heard someone crying and begging for mercy. With horror, I approached my grandmother's room and peeked through the door. What I saw made my heart stop. My grandmother stood in the middle of the room, her face twisted in a grimace of rage. On the floor in front of her was a circle of strange symbols, and in the center of this circle, a man I had never seen before was convulsing. My grandmother was chanting something in an unknown language, and her eyes glowed red. I took a step back, hoping she wouldn't notice me, but she suddenly turned to me and screamed. You weren't supposed to see this. The next moment, she vanished in a cloud of black smoke, taking the man in the circle with her. The next morning, my grandmother behaved as if nothing had happened. She made breakfast and asked how I had slept. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. But since then, I could no longer look at her the same way. Every night I was afraid to fall asleep, fearing I would see something even more horrifying. One day I decided to leave the house and move in with my parents. They were surprised by my decision but didn't object. However, even now, years later, I can't shake off the memories of that night. I often wonder who or what my grandmother really was. Recently, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was only one phrase written in red ink: "You weren't supposed to see this." Part 2: Shadows of the Past. Life with my parents seemed calm and normal, but the fear and anxiety associated with my grandmother didn't leave me. I often woke up at night in a cold sweat, remembering her sinister look and whispering in that unknown language. One day, while sorting through old things in the attic, I came across a photograph of my grandmother in her youth. On the back, it was written, Marta, 1943. The photo looked ordinary, but in her eyes there was the same eerie gleam I had seen that night. In the corner of the photo, I noticed barely discernible symbols similar to those I had seen in her book. I decided to learn more about her past. I started with research at the local library. Old newspapers and archival documents revealed to me that in 1943, several unexplained disappearances occurred in our town. Locals spoke of a witch who kidnapped people and used them for her rituals. These rumors led me to think that my grandmother might be connected to these events. I decided to return to my grandmother's house to find more evidence. At night, under the cover of darkness, I sneaked into her old house. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached her room. In the closet, I found the same book as before, but now I knew it was a spell book. On one of the pages, I discovered notes in Russian. There were instructions for performing a ritual that granted eternal youth, but required human sacrifices. In the corner of the page was a photograph of a young man, the same one I had seen in the circle. Panic gripped me. I realized that my grandmother wasn't just strange, she was a witch using dark magic. At that moment, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw my grandmother. Her face was contorted with rage, and she began to chant a spell. Suddenly, the room filled with cold, and I felt my strength draining away. I knew I had to fight. I tore the page from the book and threw it into the fireplace. The fire instantly consumed the paper, and my grandmother screamed in pain. Her body began to disintegrate, turning into ash. In her last moment, she whispered, "This is not the end, grandson. We will meet again." When it was all over, I left the house and called the police. They couldn't find any trace of my grandmother, but I knew it wasn't the end. Threatening letters continued to arrive, and I realized that her shadow would haunt me for the rest of my days.